Hello and welcome back to the Premier Injuries channel. Today we're discussing the Big Six and the injury costs to each team. Who has had the most costly injuries this season? Who has the best and worst record? Or can we even say that? Ben, let's pass it over to you because this has been a really fun project that we've worked on together. And so I'd like you to explain to everybody, what's the methodology and the thinking behind this cost per injury situation?
Yeah, so first and foremost, everybody knows that we collect reported injury incidents pertaining particularly to the Premier League. Now, you may see other reports elsewhere that try to do a similar type of things, but what we really do at Premier Injuries, we nail that down and specifically we focus on what are considered as time loss injuries. And those are injuries which result in a player that misses at least one game. And the reason that we do that, football is a contact sport. Knocks, niggles, minor ailments, they're all part and parcel of the game. And just because a person picks up a knock, that doesn't necessarily constitute an injury and may only be reflected in a session or two missed on the training pitches. So, like I say, primarily we're focusing on just injuries which result in players missing at least one game. So that in effect, gets rid of a lot of those injuries. And I mean, like I say, some reports we've seen suggested out there over the first half of the season, there's an indication that there's been 600 plus injuries. That simply isn't true. And particularly when you talk to the clubs, the backroom staff, the medical teams, they will tell you that, that simply isn't right either. It's those time loss injuries that count in. And our numbers are significantly less than that. And then also as well, just to try and contextualize, what it actually means to the clubs, particularly in and around, COVID and the pandemic, what's the impact, what's the cost to a club? And again, we've seen certain reports out there that will bandy around figures, but those figures aren't really precise. What they're worked out on is company accounts, is a calculation based on that salary expenditure per annum and then broken down per player on an average across the squad. Whereas what we like to do is, where best we can, attribute a wage, a salary specific to that individual player, calculate a daily rate, and then times that daily rate by the number of days that player may have spent on the sidelines before they return to play.
And I think it's a really good topic of discussion because quite often, especially now, because we're coming towards the business end of the season, people talk about how important certain injuries are to changing the title race. Last season, a lot of focus was on Virgil van Dijk, and there is the emotional and psychological cost, but there is a real kind of monetary cost as well to the situation. And we thought we'd start off with the Big Six because in terms of those title races, a lot of people often write the narratives around a big injury that has changed the season, and then all of a sudden a certain team can't compete anymore. But what I think will be interesting to some people, we're going to put this on the graph on screen now, is the fact that Liverpool, they're chasing the title, they're breathing down the necks of Manchester City, but they've got the most total days out of those big six teams. And it's kind of adding that context to the data again, Ben, isn't it? So drilling down into the numbers, actually 13% of those days out lost come from the injury at the start of the season too. Don't want to be rude to Harvey Elliott, but he's not like a big major squad player. So the fact that a fair chunk of Liverpool's days out lost have come to that from that player. And then interestingly, moving it onto the cost situation that we'll get onto, it's so different. But first of all, with the days out cost, Ben, do you want to kind of explain how maybe a team, just because they have a high number of days lost, doesn't always reflect poorly on their medical department?
Yeah, absolutely not. I mean, there's lots of influence and factors, and people take these figures very much on face value. There are headline grabbers, and it's never black and white. It's always important to contextualize things. For example, and you touched upon it, individuals within a team. Harvey Elliott, yes, Liverpool are well stocked in that area of the pitch. However, if we look at, say, somebody like Leeds, the injuries to Calvin Phillips, to Liam Cooper, to Patrick Bamford. Leeds are the only team so far this season at the time of reporting that had exceeded 1,000 days lost up until that point, way beyond anybody else. The impact on their squad, with it being a smaller, more tight-knit Europe, is huge. And that's why we see, more than lately, amongst other things, why Leeds are struggling at the bottom of the table. But also as well, you look at exposure, and by that, what we mean is the number of minutes played. So you tend to see that the teams have played more minutes exposure, they're at increased risk of injury incidents. So again, during that first half of the campaign, no team had played more minutes than Chelsea, over 2,600 minutes, whereas the likes of Watford, they're around about sort of 1,600 minutes. Now, to put that into perspective, you're basically saying that Chelsea have played 11 more games across all competitions when directly compared to Watford. Now, it stands to reason that Chelsea, given that the massive disparity in minutes played, should, in theory, have lots more injuries than Watford. And again, like I say, that's not reflective of any medical department, any team, or anything like that. This is just the facts of the matter, isn't? And it's not, we're not comparing apples with apples. There are a lot of nuances and other factors to consider. So never ever just look at these numbers in pure isolation.
And I like the fact that you brought up Chelsea here, because we are talking about the big six and title challengers, or even European pushing for the Champions League. And I think a fair and maybe interesting comparison might be with Chelsea to Arsenal, because you look at what's happened with Chelsea this season, and it hasn't been the best. They've lost Romelu Lukaku to injury. They've lost Reece James to injury. They've lost Ben Chilwell. They've had a fairly disrupted season. Yes, they're above Arsenal. They're above, most of these teams. They are in third in the Premier League table. And then you kind of look at Arsenal, who historically have had questions asked over their ability to keep their squad together. And they're actually the lowest in terms of days out of those top six teams. And I think it's quite interesting that maybe their ability to push for the Champions League spots might be aided by this as well. And that could be one of the stories of the season, that the fact that the injury department at Arsenal has done a really good job on a very small squad as well. That's one of the things people have to factor in, that Arsenal have kind of cut a lot of dead wood, and so they're working with a lot less numbers. But let's move it to the next graph. And I think this is the interesting thing. Manchester United dwarf everybody else. They're up there with £16.2 million lost because of these injuries. And so 35% of Manchester United's injury costs come from just two players. So we looked at Harvey Elliott at costing, Liverpool in terms of that 13% of their days lost out, but 35% of the value of the cost of injuries for Manchester United coming from just two injuries is huge stuff. And I would say, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, but they're fairly innocuous injuries as well. They're not huge ones. They're not like an ACL that's going to take you out for the season, like we mentioned Ben Chilwell a little bit earlier. This was a hip flexor strain and a hamstring strain. So again, adding to the discussions there, it really does show the difference in maybe the spending of these big teams as well, doesn't it, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. When you're talking about some of, the modern day players, Cristiano Ronaldo reportedly weekly salary in and around maybe £450,000, £500,000 per week. It's easy to see how those numbers can, quickly add up. Paul Pogba, one of the top earners at the club. And of course, he picked up that injury while on international duty representing France. We've seen it looked, he talked about a fairly innocuous kicking action. He was just, generally warming up, taking a few shots, pulled up. An initial sort of timeline suggests that it wasn't too severe, but that day extended way beyond anyone's thought. But however, just a little bit of insight into that. And yes, we're attributing all of this cost being absorbed by Manchester United and the fact that they'd have to pay salaries to Paul Pogba. But what not a lot of people may know is that the football federations and the relevant football associations, actually, if a player does pick up an injury that typically extends beyond 28 days, then they have an insurance policy in place and clubs are reimbursed for that. So yes, for the purposes of this study, it is picked up by Manchester United and reflected there. But the reality of the situation is that the French Football Federation will have paid a large chunk of Paul Pogba's salary and associated fees because he was actually injured while representing his national team.
Oh, it's a really interesting talking point. And once again, with the methodology that we talk about at the start, just adding the realities of the situations here that aren't often talked about when people discuss the cost of injuries. The one final thing in terms of the team by team costs that I think was absolutely amazing was the disparity between the top three. So that was Liverpool, Chelsea, and Manchester United, who were 12 million, 15 million, and 16 million. Once again, Manchester United there, the most costly. But then the bottom three of the big six, Manchester City, which might shock a lot of people because of how much they spend and how much they spend on wages, Tottenham and Arsenal, their total in terms of cost of injuries is 19 million altogether. So again, maybe a testament to the fact that these departments have done well with managing their injuries and maybe looking at who actually got injured in their squad. But it does give you a testament to the fact that Liverpool, Manchester United, and Chelsea's injuries together were 44.8 million, a real gulf even in between the top six there. But the final thing that I thought was a good talking point was also comparing the most costly injury from each team. You've already covered about the situation with Paul Pogba. Ben Chilwell is one that a lot of people will be talking about, a huge absence there for Chelsea and for England as well. But Thiago Alcantara, I mean, he's one that's maybe gone under the surface because he's been in and out of that Liverpool squad, hasn't he, Ben?
He has, yes, and he's a great player, when he's in and around that squad, but he's been dogged and hampered by persistent soft tissue problems, which would mean that he's been in and out that squad. And because of those periods of absence, it's a little bit disjointed. Like you say, it's probably come under the radar just a little bit. But when you accumulate all of those days together, all those time loss absences, like I say, that's reflected in the high sort of cost that has to be absorbed by the club for his time on the sidelines.
And then I think the big one at Arsenal has been Granit Xhaka's absence. In terms of the football as well, he's somebody that you saw when he wasn't in the squad. He was a huge miss tactically. He's a really important player for the team. But what was his injury, Ben, that kept him out?
So that was an MCL injury. That was a medial collateral ligament problem that he picked up in the North London derby. I don't recollect exactly the Tottenham player who he collided with. It was fairly innocuous. But the powers of recovery for Granit Xhaka, we've seen it time and time again. He's somebody that look, he has his detractors, and I know there've been issues in the past, but what you can't knock the guy for is his dedication and his effort and his focus on recovering from those injuries. Like I said, well ahead of schedule. And you hit the nail on the head. Arsenal are a different team, when he's in that starting 11. And, given the fact that Mikel Arteta is working with a very tight, close-knit squad, they cannot afford to carry too many injuries at this moment because, you started to pull out a couple of key pivotal players in that squad, and quite quickly, any hopes of a Champions League qualification spot will slip away.
And in terms of it, moving it to Manchester City, it's Ferran Torres. He's no longer at the club. And I think one of the big successes for Manchester City this season is the low number of injuries that they've had, the low cost that they've had. And this will obviously aid them with the title race. But I think this is something maybe once again a little bit overlooked, a real testament of how that squad has been managed so well. Because Ferran Torres, I wouldn't say he's one of the main players or was one of the main players at Manchester City. He is the biggest name that they've had out this season. The rest of the time, most of the squad have been fit, basically. Isn't that right, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, you can look at maybe Ruben Dias as a current hamstring injury problem. That was initially around about a 4 to 6 week. There is some talk or suggestion that he could return ahead of schedule. But season on season, this group overall tend to remain relatively fit. Now, again, that's very reflective of the very, all of the hard work that the backroom staff have done in terms of, the load management, the planning, the sessions, Pep in his rotation, because we're talking about a team that's playing at the very highest level in one of the most competitive, high intensity, high octane leagues in the world. They're playing in the Champions League. So, to manage those situations with high number of exposure in minutes and keeping those players fit and available hasn't been easy. We've seen Kevin De Bruyne in the past have his problems. He came in on the back of issues with regarding his ankle, but overall and generally, the Manchester City squad have been relatively fit for several years, and of course, there are elements of luck involved in that. That's just the very nature of the sport. But like I say, you need to commend and recognize the work of not just, again, the backroom staff, but also the players as well. Because, without looking after themselves, without the right nutrition, without the right hydration, without, the time away from the club where they're doing the things off the field right, none of this happens. This isn't by accident, by the way. This is a lot of hard work and dedication to their craft to attain and try to reach those, to eke out every possible last ounce to maintain and reach those highest levels.
And the final one is Heung-Min Son. Again, just to emphasize how much Paul Pogba has cost, it's nearly 5 times it would have cost it in comparison of the two there. Just 740,000. Obviously, for you and I, 740,000 is a lot of money, but it is quite telling that Tottenham's biggest injury there, I guess in comparison, they probably don't have as big a wage budget as well. But with his muscular injury there, that was their biggest hit to the books. And it is quite interesting, the varying stories between the certain teams. But I think that is all that we wanted to cover in this one. We've covered the top 6. We've covered the top 6 players of those teams as well that's cost the most. We've got a good little series coming on now, so make sure to subscribe to the channel, because we're going to be talking about the worst team in the Premier League, or worst in inverted commas. We don't really like to describe them as such, the cost of COVID, and some other great episodes all about injury costs this season, and you're not going to want to miss it. Make sure to like the video if you've enjoyed it, comment below if you've got any questions about the cost of injuries this season, and we will see you again very, very soon.